She tore the veil from her face before the church doors even closed behind her. Her hands weren't shaking from cold. They were shaking from rage. Margaret Calloway had just watched the man she was supposed to marry sign her father's land over to himself at the altar in front of God and every soul in Harlan Creek, and smile at her like she ought to be grateful. She didn't cry. She ran. If you've ever had to choose between a safe life and an honest one, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel, follow Margaret's story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The veil hit the dirt road at the edge of town, and the summer wind took it. Margaret Calloway watched it go. She didn't reach for it. She stood at the edge of Harlan Creek's main street, in her mother's ivory dress with the lace collar her sister had sewn by candlelight 3 nights before the wedding, and she let that veil tumble into the dust like it was the last thing she ever intended to own. Behind her, the church doors were still open. She could hear voices. Her father's voice, first low and controlled the tone he used when he needed people to believe he was calm. Then Aldous Fenwick's voice, which was the voice of a man who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered to him. She had been told her whole life that Aldous Fenwick was a good catch. She had been told he was steady, prosperous, well-regarded. She had been told that a woman like her, 27 years old, her mother dead 2 winters past her father's ranch, running on debt and dry prayers, ought to consider herself fortunate that a man of Aldous Fenwick's standing had looked her direction at all. What she had not been told was that her father had already signed the ranch over to Aldous 6 weeks before the ceremony. She found that out when Aldous pulled the deed from his breast pocket during the vows, unfolded it in front of the preacher and said, clear as Sunday morning, that he wanted the congregation to witness that the Calloway land was now legally part of Fenwick Holdings effective upon completion of the ceremony. He said it like he was giving her a gift. He said it like the ranch, her grandmother's ranch, the land her mother had worked until her hands bled, the 40 acres her father had wept over every drought season for 20 years, was a detail, a formality, something to be filed and forgotten. Margaret had looked at her father. Her father had looked at the floor. That was when she understood that the man who raised her had sold her along with the property. She walked out during the silence that followed Aldous's announcement, not running, not weeping. She walked the way her mother had always walked when something was wrong and tears were not going to fix it. Straight-backed, chin-level hands loose at her sides. She heard her name called twice before she reached the door. She did not turn around. The horse she took was her own. Nobody could argue that. Pepper was a 7-year-old gray mare with a white blaze and a temper that matched her name, and Margaret had broken her herself 3 summers ago in the south pasture while her father watched from the fence and said she'd never manage it. She managed it. She managed the horse, and she managed the saddle without help, and she managed to get 3 miles outside of Harlan Creek before the dress became a genuine problem. The skirt was too wide for riding astride and kept bunching under her thighs. The lace collar was tight, and the afternoon heat was brutal. Her hair was still pinned up in the elaborate arrangement her sister Clara had spent 2 hours constructing that morning, and every piece of it was beginning to slide. She stopped at Teller's Creek, dismounted, and stood in the shallow water in her wedding shoes while Pepper drank beside her. She pulled every pin from her hair and let it fall. She rolled the skirt up above her knees and tied it with the satin sash. She removed the lace collar and dropped it in the current and watched it float away. Then she remounted and rode north. She did not have a plan. What she had was a direction away and a name her brother James had written in a letter before he disappeared into the mountains 18 months ago. A name and a direction, and $40 in emergency money she had sewn into the lining of her traveling bag, which was still sitting on the pew in the church where she had left it. She had nothing but the horse and the dress and the $40 that wasn't there. She had north. She rode north. The storm came down from the peaks without warning, the way mountain storms always did in late July. One moment the sky was white and still blazing with that particular aggressive summer light that turned everything pale and washed out and merciless. The next moment the clouds came off the ridgeline like something that had been held back by force and finally broke free. Thunder first, then lightning cracking the sky open somewhere above the tree line. Then the rain, which was not the gentle kind. Margaret had never been above the foothills in a mountain storm. She had lived her whole life in the valley where storms were horizontal and loud, but mostly manageable, where you could see them coming from an hour away and get yourself inside. This was different. The rain came sideways. The trail. If it was still a trail, she had lost the clear path somewhere in the last mile, turned to dark mud under Pepper's hooves. The mare was frightened. Margaret could feel it in the way the horse's muscles bunched and trembled beneath her, the way Pepper kept tossing her head and trying to slow. "Easy," Margaret said, which was not particularly useful. She was trying to remember what James had written. He'd written about a man named Callum. Callum Ross, she thought. Or possibly Callum Rowe. James's handwriting was poor on his best days, and the letter had been water-stained at the edges. He'd described the man as antisocial, difficult, and possibly the finest horseman in the Montana Territory, which, coming from James, who admired very little, meant something considerable. He'd written that Callum's place was north of the Third Ridge, in a valley with a creek running east to west. She was looking for a third ridge. She had no idea how many ridges she had crossed. Lightning struck something close. The crack of it went through her chest. Pepper screamed and bolted sideways off the trail. Margaret lost a stirrup, grabbed mane, stayed on through sheer stubbornness, and spent the next minute fighting the horse back toward something resembling forward. When she finally got, Pepper stopped. They were both breathing hard, standing at the edge of a drop she couldn't see the bottom of in the rain and the dark. And somewhere very close, a man's voice said, "That's about 6 feet of nothing between your horse's front hooves and a 40-foot fall. I'd suggest backing up." She backed up. The man came out of the trees to her left. He was on horseback, a large black horse that moved through the storm like the weather was of no particular consequence, and he was wearing a long canvas coat with the collar turned up and a hat pulled down so that most of his face was shadow. What she could see was enough. How was big. Not just tall, but built like the mountains behind him, broad through the shoulders and the chest. The kind of physical presence that suggested years of genuine work, rather than the performed strength of men who wanted to look powerful. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he cannot immediately explain. His horse stopped 10 feet away. "You're in a wedding dress," he said. "I'm aware." "In a mountain storm." "I'm aware of that too." He looked past her back the way she'd come. "Anybody following you?" "I don't know. Probably." "Probably," he repeated, like the word had a flavor he didn't care for. "Who?" "The man I declined to marry. And possibly my father." She paused. "They may be together." "Are either of them the type to come up this trail in the dark in a thunderstorm?" She thought about Aldous Fenwick, who kept his boots polished even on his own ranch and had never once to her knowledge been more than mildly inconvenienced. "The first one, no. My father might." The man looked at her for another long moment. "You're going to fall off that horse," he said. "I haven't fallen off yet." "You nearly went over a cliff 30 seconds ago." "Nearly isn't the same as did." Something shifted in his expression. She couldn't read it in the dark. He turned his horse without another word and said flatly, "Follow close. Don't let her drift right." It wasn't an invitation. It was barely even an instruction. It was the tone of a man who had calculated a problem and arrived at the least irritating solution. Margaret followed. The cabin was dark when they reached it, which meant it took her a moment to understand how large it actually was. Not a trapper's shack. Not a line camp. A real structure built low and solid against the slope with a wide covered porch and a separate barn set back to the east. There were horses in the paddock, she could hear them, and chickens complaining somewhere under cover, and the smell of wood smoke and pine, and something cooking that made her realize she hadn't eaten since before dawn. The man dismounted and led both horses under the barn overhang without asking her whether she needed help. She dismounted herself, landed awkwardly on the muddy ground, and nearly lost a shoe. "Inside," he said. "Doors unlocked." She went inside. The interior was plain and clean, in the way of someone who lived alone and had no tolerance for clutter. A stone fireplace on the north wall burned down to coals. A table with 2 chairs. a single iron bed against the far wall. Shelves with the kind of careful organization that spoke of a man who knew exactly where everything was and required it to stay there. A dog looked up from beside the fireplace. It was enormous, a great gray mixed thing with yellow eyes, and it studied her with calm suspicion before putting its head back down. Margaret stood dripping on the floorboards and tried to decide whether the past 6 hours of her life were real. The man came in behind her, shook his hat, and hung it on a peg by the door. Without the hat, she could see his face. He was perhaps 40. Dark hair, thick and a little long with some gray starting at the temples. A beard that had not been trimmed with any recent urgency. A face that had been out in the weather for most of its life. Deeply weathered, heavy-browed, with dark eyes that were currently looking at the puddle she was making on his floor with the same expression he might give a minor structural problem. "Callum Ross," she said. He went still. "My brother mentioned you," she said. "James Calloway." Whatever she'd expected, recognition warmth, some softening of the flat expression, didn't happen. What happened instead was that Callum Ross turned away from her, crouched in front of the fireplace, and began rebuilding the fire. His back was a wall. "James Calloway is dead," he said. The words went into her like something physical. "I know," she said when she could speak. "He died last October. I know." Callum said nothing. "He wrote about you, before he died. He said if I ever needed—" She stopped. She hadn't planned this part of the conversation, because she hadn't planned any of this. She had run. She was still running. "He said you were an honest man." Callum stood and faced her. "He was wrong about a lot of things," he said. "But he was right that I've got no patience for other people's problems. Eat something and dry out. At first light, you're going back down." "I can't go back down." "You can. You will. Aldous Fenwick has my father's ranch. That's not my business. He had my father sign it over before the ceremony, without my knowledge. I was going to be married into a situation that—" She stopped again. She pressed her hands flat against her stomach, which was the thing she did when she was trying to keep her voice level. "He bought me along with the property, Mr. Ross, and my father let him. And if I go back, I have no legal standing, no money, no home, and nowhere to go that Fenwick doesn't own or influence." Callum looked at her for a long time. "That's a hard situation," he said. "Yes. Still not my business." He went to the stove. She stood there. "James told me about the eastern pasture," she said. "The disputed boundary. He said you'd been fighting the Fenwick survey claim for 3 years. Callum's hand stopped on the pot handle. "He said Aldous Fenwick has been running cattle over your northern line since the spring of '81, she said. "He said you filed 3 complaints with the county recorder and they were all dismissed." Callum turned around. His expression had changed. Not softer, more dangerous. "What exactly did your brother tell you?" he said. "Enough," she said. "James was a surveyor before he died. He found something. He wrote me a letter and told me to find you if I ever needed to understand what he found." She reached into the top of her bodice, the one pocket she had in the entire ruined dress, and removed a folded piece of paper. She held it out. Callum crossed the room. He took the paper. He unfolded it carefully, the way a man handles something he suspects might matter. He read it. He folded it again. Was quiet for long enough that the fire crackled twice and the dog shifted in its sleep. Then he said, "Sit down before you fall down." It was not kindness. It was the same practical calculation as before. But he set the paper on the table and put a bowl in front of her and poured coffee without being asked, and Margaret Calloway sat down in a mountain man's cabin in her ruined wedding dress and ate the best beans she had ever tasted in her life. She slept in the chair. She hadn't intended to. She had intended to be alert and watchful and ready for whatever came next, because the kind of woman who runs from her own wedding is theoretically the kind of woman who doesn't simply fall asleep at a stranger's table. She woke up with the dog's head in her lap and a blanket over her shoulders that she had not put there herself. Morning light was coming through the single east-facing window. The fire was fed. The coffee was fresh. Callum Ross was outside. She could hear him moving in the barn. the low sound of his voice talking to horses in the unhurried way of a man more comfortable with animals than people. She folded the blanket neatly and set it on the table. She looked at James's letter, which was still where Callum had left it. She had read it so many times in the past 8 months that she had memorized it, but she read it again anyway. Margaret, it said. If you're reading this, the way I think you might eventually read this, things have gotten worse than I hoped. Find Callum Ross. He knows where the water runs. He knows what Fenwick moved and why. I couldn't stay to finish it, but I hid what matters. Callum will understand. He was there when the mountain told the truth. Don't trust the recorder's office. Don't trust Harlan Creek. And don't marry Aldous Fenwick for any reason, including father's debts. The debts are Fenwick's plan. Everything is Fenwick's plan. The proof is in the High Valley. Callum knows the High Valley. I love you. I'm sorry I waited too long to say the important things out loud. James. She heard boots on the porch. Callum came in, stamped the mud off, and stopped when he saw her awake with the letter. How long had James been working for you? She asked. How wasn't working for me? Callum poured himself coffee and leaned against the far counter with the deliberate posture of a man keeping space between himself and a conversation he didn't want. He was mapping water sources for the Territorial Land Office. He took extra work on the side doing private surveys. I hired him to mark my eastern boundary properly because the county line was wrong. Fenwick's line, she said. The recorded line, Callum said, which happens to benefit Fenwick by about 200 acres and 2 reliable springs. James found something that proved the original line. Callum was quiet. Mr. Ross. He found something, Callum said. Yes. And he hid it. Before he could bring it out, he disappeared. Callum set his cup down. His jaw was tight. I looked for him. I went to the county. I went to the marshal. Every door closed. Because Fenwick owns the marshal. Because Fenwick owns most of what runs in and out of this county, Callum said with a flatness that was angrier than shouting. Margaret looked at him carefully. James said you'd been fighting Fenwick for 3 years, she said. Why haven't you sold? Because it's my land. A lot of people have sold. I'm not a lot of people. She nodded slowly. She believed him. She also understood for the first time that James had sent her here not merely because Callum was honest, but because Callum was the one person in the territory that Aldous Fenwick had not managed to move. I want to find what James hid, she said. You're going down the mountain at first light, Callum said. I'm not going back to Harlan Creek. I didn't say Harlan Creek, I said down the mountain. Where do you suggest I go? Fenwick has connections to every town south of here. My father has already... She stopped. She started again. My father made his choice. I'm not asking for his help, I'm asking for yours. I don't do charity. I'm not asking for charity either. I'm asking you to help me finish what my brother started. James was murdered for what he found. Fenwick is using forged land claims to steal water rights from every small ranch in this valley. You know where the High Valley is. I know how to read survey records, and I know James's system, and I know what the original documents should contain. Together we can... No. The word landed flat and final. No, he said again, in case the first time hadn't been sufficient. I run cattle and horses on this mountain. I'm one man. Fighting Fenwick in a courthouse requires lawyers and money and influence, none of which I have, and I'm not interested in becoming a cause. James died for this. James made his own choices. He made them trying to help you. The silence after that was different from the silence before it. Callum walked to the window. Margaret watched his back. You can stay 3 days, he said finally, until the storm passes and I can figure out a direction that's safe for you to travel. The High Valley. 3 days, he said. And we don't discuss the High Valley. She said nothing, which was not the same thing as agreeing. The trouble arrived on the second morning. Margaret was in the barn with the gray mare when she heard horses on the lower trail, more than 2 moving fast for the terrain. The dog heard them first. He came out of the barn with his hackles up and stood in the center of the yard with his yellow eyes pointed south, and the particular stillness of him was a language she was starting to understand. She went to find Callum. He was already on the porch with the rifle. He watched the trail for a long moment. Then he said without looking at her, "Get inside. Stay away from the windows." "How many?" "4, maybe 5. He still didn't look at her. "Inside. Now." "I'm not—" He turned his head. She went inside. She stayed away from the windows, except for one where she stood at an angle and watched. 3 men rode into the yard. They were wearing trail clothes and carrying rifles, and she recognized one of them, a square-built, humorless man named Garrett, who ran the Fenwick operation east of the creek. He'd been at her failed wedding. He'd been standing in the back of the church with his arms crossed like a sentry. Callum stood on the porch and did not come down. "Ross," Garrett said. "Garrett, you seen a woman come through here, on a gray mare, dark hair, wearing a—" He glanced at the other men. Something crossed his face that might have been embarrassment in a different kind of man. A wedding dress. "Lots of people come through here," Callum said. "This particular woman is the property of—" "Stop right there," Callum said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The quality of it changed in a way that was more effective than volume. "Try that sentence again," he said, "without the word property." Garrett shifted in the saddle. "She's a woman under contract of marriage to Mr. Aldous Fenwick. Her departure before the ceremony was completed creates a legal—" "A ceremony requires 2 willing parties," Callum said. "What you're describing isn't a contract. Ride back down." "Mr. Fenwick wants his—" "I said ride back down." There was a pause. The kind of pause that meant the men were doing calculations. Callum was 1 man on a porch with a rifle, and they were 3. The math wasn't complicated, except that the dog had moved to the base of the porch steps and gone utterly still. And something about that stillness changed the calculation in a way that Garrett clearly didn't care for. "This isn't finished," Garrett said. "Most things aren't," Callum said. They rode out. Callum watched until the sound of them faded. Then he came inside. Margaret was standing in the middle of the room. She had a cast-iron skillet in her right hand, which she set down carefully. Callum looked at the skillet, then at her. "Is that your plan?" he said. "A pan." "I was improvising," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was so close to a laugh, though, that she stored it up because she suspected she would not hear many more. "They'll go to the county," he said. "By tomorrow morning someone will have filed papers, abandonment of contract possibly, depending on what lawyer Fenwick uses." "Can he do that legally?" "He can try. He's got the recorder and the marshal. He's got 3 judges south of the ridge. Up here—" Callum stopped. "Up here, the law is whoever's holding the rifle." "Then I need to find James's proof before they come back," she said. Callum was quiet for a long moment. I went to the shelf and took down a battered journal and set it on the table. He opened it to a page with a rough hand-drawn map. He didn't say anything. She sat down and looked at the map. She looked up at him. "The High Valley," she said. 3 days, he said. "That's all I'm committing to." 3 days, she agreed. She didn't mention that she intended to use every hour of them. That evening after supper, she asked him how he'd come to the mountain. He was cleaning the rifle with the systematic care of a man doing something he'd done 10,000 times, and he didn't look up when she asked. "This was my uncle's land," he said. "I came north 12 years ago when the valley got too crowded." "Too crowded meaning Fenwick?" "Meaning people in general." He set the cloth down. "I'm not sociable by nature." "I gathered," she said. He glanced at her. "James talked about you like you were a decent man," she said. "He didn't say easy. He said decent." Callum was quiet for a moment. James had a generous way of reading people. "Did he read you wrong?" He picked up the cloth again. "I don't know yet." She thought that was perhaps the most honest thing she'd heard in a year. She looked at the fire, and he cleaned his rifle, and the storm outside moved east, and the first genuine quiet she'd felt since she could remember settled over the room like something earned. He didn't ask her to leave that night. She didn't offer to go. In the morning they were going to the High Valley. What they would find there, what James had died to protect, neither of them said aloud. But the letter sat on the table between them. He knows what Fenwick moved and why. How was there when the mountain told the truth? Whatever the mountain had witnessed, it was waiting. And Margaret Calloway, who had already run from one life, was done running from anything else. They left before the sun cleared the ridge. Callum handed her a pair of his old trail boots at the door, 2 large by 2 sizes, stuffed with wool at the toe, and said nothing about the wedding dress, except that she'd need to change it or lose it to the brush before mid-morning. He left a folded pair of work trousers and a cotton shirt on the chair. Without comment, went outside and gave her the privacy of the closed door. She changed quickly. The trousers were enormous in the waist, and she belted them with the satin sash she'd kept from the dress. The shirt smelled like pine soap and wood smoke. She rolled the sleeves 4 times. When she came out, Callum looked at her, the way he looked at most things, like he was calculating whether this situation was going to be more trouble than anticipated, and then he turned and picked up his saddlebags. "Keep close," he said, "and don't touch anything until I tell you what it is. I grew up on a ranch, Mr. Ross." "Valley Ranch," he said. "Different mountain." She followed him to the horses without arguing, because she suspected he was right, and she wasn't yet willing to admit it out loud. The dog came with them. He moved at Callum's left heel without instruction, and Margaret noticed that Callum never once looked down to check on him. The animal simply existed in his orbit, quiet and certain, and she thought that this was probably what it looked like when trust had no need to announce itself. They rode north and east away from the lower trail where Garrett and his men had come. For the first hour, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret said, "James's letter mentions a high valley with a secondary water source, a spring that runs east from the ridge. I know the spring. He said the original survey plates would be near the water." "He told me the same thing," Callum said, "before he disappeared." She absorbed that. "You knew where to look." "I knew roughly." "Then why haven't you—" She stopped herself before the rest of it came out, because she heard how it would sound, and she was trying to be fair. But Callum heard it anyway. "Why haven't I gone to get it myself?" he said. "I wasn't going to say it like that." "But that's the question." She didn't answer. He rode for another moment, his eyes on the trail. Then he said, "Because the last time I went up that trail, James was with me. We were going to retrieve what he'd hidden. We made camp below the tree line." He paused. "In the morning he was gone. His horse, his kit, his notes. Gone. I spent 4 days searching, and found nothing. Found blood on a rock above the East Creek," he said flatly. "Not enough to say what happened. Enough to say something did." Margaret was quiet. "So no," he said. "I haven't gone back. Because going back alone means whatever happened to James happens to me, and then there's nobody left who knows where the plates are, and nobody left who gives a damn about that eastern boundary, except Fenwick, who'll be pleased to have the problem disappear." She understood then. He hadn't been hiding from grief or anger or cowardice. He had been doing the same arithmetic she always did when something felt impossible, calculating odds, weighing outcomes, waiting for a variable that changed the equation. She was apparently the variable. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. "James was trained to read survey measurements," she said. "I helped him practice when he was learning. I know his notation system. I know what the plates should contain and what the legitimate territorial seals look like. If Fenwick's people have been manufacturing false records, I'll know the difference." Callum glanced at her sideways. "You sure about that?" "Yes." No hesitation. "I've had 8 months to think about nothing else, Mr. Ross. I'm very sure." He turned back to the trail. "Then you're more useful than I expected." She wasn't certain that was a compliment. She accepted it as one anyway. They reached the first high meadow before noon, and that was where the first sign of trouble made itself known. The dog stopped. Callum stopped with him, one hand rising in a gesture she'd already learned meant be still and don't ask questions yet. She pulled Pepper up and waited. The dog's nose worked the air. His ears moved forward and then flattened slightly. Callum dismounted without sound and handed his reins to her. He moved to the tree line on the east side of the meadow in a way that covered ground without announcing itself, and she sat with both horses and worked very hard on not breathing loudly. He was back in 4 minutes. 2 men, he said quietly, taking his reins back. Camped last night on the north side of that meadow. Fire's cold. They moved on this morning. Fenwick's. Garrett doesn't use that many men for a simple retrieval. He remounted. He brought more after last night. They split up. 2 went south, 2 came this way. They're looking for the valley. Or they already know where it is, and they're making sure we don't get there first. Margaret thought about that. James's notes. If Fenwick's men found his camp the morning you discovered him missing, then they may have found partial information, Callum said. Not enough to locate the plates without someone who knows James's system, but enough to narrow it down. She looked at him. Then we need to be faster than they are. We need to be smarter than they are, he said. Fast gets you dead in the mountains. Smart gets you home. They changed direction. He took a longer route that cut over a rockier ridge, harder on the horses, and harder on her spine. But it would intersect the high valley from the west rather than the north where the 2 men had gone. She didn't complain about the ridge. She didn't ask how long it would take. She saved her breath for the climb. It was on that ridge 2 hours later, with both horses blowing hard, and the summer sky stretched out wide and enormous above them, that Callum asked her about the wedding. Not directly. That wasn't his style. He asked it sideways, the way he seemed to do everything that cost him something. You knew, he said, about the land, before the ceremony. Not until he pulled the deed out, she said. You had no indication. She thought about it honestly. I had indications. I told myself they were something else. He was quiet, waiting. Aldous was careful, she said. Attentive. He always knew exactly what to say and when to say it. My father was comfortable around him, which I took as a recommendation because my father is a good judge of character about most things. She paused. I didn't understand that Aldous was simply very good at identifying what a person needed to hear and providing it until the transaction was complete. You weren't in love with him, Callum said. It wasn't a question. No, she said. I thought I might have been at the beginning. But it became quieter than that. More like a practical arrangement we were both politely pretending had warmth. She looked at the horizon. I thought that was what most marriages eventually became. And now? Now I think I was wrong about that, she said. Among other things. He didn't say anything to that, but he also didn't look away as quickly as he usually did. They rode down off the ridge in silence, and she thought about the fact that she'd just told a man she'd known for 2 days, something she'd never said to anyone, and she wasn't sure whether that meant she trusted him or whether it meant she was simply so far outside her ordinary life that ordinary rules didn't apply. Maybe both. Maybe neither. She was still working on it. They smelled the smoke before they saw what caused it. Callum pulled up hard. She came alongside, and he said one word, camp. Not a cook fire. The smell was too large, too varied, burnt canvas, burnt leather, the particular chemical edge of something treated with oil going up in flame. She understood a moment before he said it. James's cache. They pushed the horses hard, down through the switchbacks, and when they broke into the small clearing near the East Creek, the damage was already finished. A weathered canvas packet, the kind used for protecting survey documents from moisture, lay in the center of a blackened circle. It had been burned deliberately, methodically. Someone had made certain nothing inside it survived. Callum dismounted and crouched over the ash. Margaret crouched beside him. She reached into the debris and came up with a small piece of metal. Not paper. Metal held differently. She turned it over. A fragment of copper no larger than her palm. One edge was clean, and the impression of a straight line and a partial number was still legible. Survey plate, she said quietly. How much of it? She studied it. Her chest was tight in a way she was working to control. Not enough. Not on its own. She looked at the debris. But this wasn't everything. James never kept all of it in one place. She looked up. He had a system. You hide the evidence in pieces. If one location is found, the others survive. You know where the others are. If I can read the rest of the letter properly, yes. She sat back on her heels. He gave me numbers I didn't understand at the time. I thought they were distances. They might be coordinates in his notation system. Then someone knew enough to find this cache, Callum said. But not enough to find the others. Or they found this one first, and they're working from the same partial information we are. She stood. We need to move. If they're working the valley systematically, there are 2 other locations James would have used. One near moving water, one elevated. Callum stood. He was looking at the tree line. The dog's watching something, he said. Margaret looked. The dog was facing northeast, perfectly still. The hackles on his spine were raised in a thin line. Callum said very quietly, "Don't run. Walk to your horse. Mount up slow." She walked to Pepper, mounted slow. A voice from the northeast tree line said, "Smart woman." There were 2 of them. The men who'd made camp in the high meadow, she assumed. One was young, perhaps 25, with the easy posture of someone who'd spent years being the most dangerous person in a room. The other was older and quieter, which she had already learned was generally worse. They came out of the trees on horseback. Both had rifles across their saddles. The younger one looked at Callum. Mr. Fenwick would like his property returned. His property, Callum said. The woman. Callum didn't move. You've been told once. I won't explain it again. The older man was watching Margaret. She's got something in her hand. She realized she was still holding the copper fragment. She closed her fingers around it. Set that down, ma'am, the older man said. Not unkindly. That was somehow worse. I don't think I will, she said. The younger man raised his rifle. The dog moved. He didn't bark. He crossed the clearing in complete silence and put himself between the horses and something about that particular silence. An animal that large, that fast, that quiet made the younger man's horse throw its head and step back sharply. Callum used the 3 seconds. He got between Margaret and both rifles with his horse, in a movement that looked almost casual, except that the Winchester was in his hand now, and the angle of it made very clear that if anyone moved first, the next thing that happened was going to be irreversible. Your horses are going to be trouble in this terrain, Callum said. Mine aren't. The dog isn't. We know this mountain. He paused. You don't. The older man studied him. This isn't over, he said. No. Callum agreed. It isn't. Tell Fenwick I said so. They left. Margaret let out the breath she'd been holding for approximately 2 minutes. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them with mild irritation, as though they belonged to someone else and were behaving irresponsibly. Callum turned his horse beside her. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. You held it together, he said. I was terrified. I know, he said. You held it together anyway. That's the part that matters. She looked at him. He wasn't offering her comfort, she realized. He was making an observation, noting a fact. The same voice he used to note that a water source was reliable or a trail was solid. She found unexpectedly that this was the most reassuring thing anyone had said to her in years. Where now? She asked. Moving water first. If James's system is what you're describing, he would have used the east branch of the upper creek for the second cache. He turned north. And we're going to get there before they regroup. She followed him into the trees. They rode hard for the next hour and didn't speak, which suited her because she needed to think. She was running through James's letter again, the version she carried in her memory rather than on paper. The numbers she'd dismissed as distances. She reconstructed them carefully, the way James had taught her to reconstruct measurements. Start with what you know is fixed work. Outward, don't assume. He'd written 4 sets of numbers in a sequence that had seemed random. They weren't distances. They were the notation system James used for marking cache locations relative to natural landmarks. She understood that now. She should have understood it 8 months ago, and she hadn't, and she was going to live with that. The first set had pointed to the burned cache. The second set. She worked it slowly, carefully, riding through her brother's logic, pointed to moving water and an elevation change of approximately 40 feet. Moving water running east. 40-foot elevation change from a fixed point. The east branch of the upper creek. Callum was right. The third set was elevated. High point relative to two visible landmarks. And the fourth set was the one she'd been trying to parse for months. She'd thought it was a distance measurement. Long implausible as a cache distance. But now, working through the structure differently, she thought it might be a name. James had a secondary notation system for proper names. He assigned numeric values to letters in a specific pattern that their mother had taught them as a children's game. She translated it carefully in her head, moving through each value. The letters came out as B-O-O-N-E. She nearly pulled her horse up. Boone. That was a person's name. She knew that name. Everyone in the county knew that name. Marshal Calvin Boone. The man whose office had received every one of Callum's complaints. The man who had processed James's missing person report. The man who had, in every interaction she could remember, appeared to be the one decent impartial figure in the county's legal structure. James had hidden something connected to Boone, or hidden it with Boone's name as the key, or, and this possibility, arrived slowly, like cold water. James had found something about Boone that he needed to record and hide. She wasn't going to say this to Callum yet. She needed to be certain. But her chest was doing something uncomfortable. The East Creek was running fast for midsummer, fed by snowmelt that came late this far up the mountain. Callum found the landmark without hesitation, a particular configuration of 3 boulders at the creek bend that was exactly the kind of fixed geographic point James would have noted in his survey work. She watched Callum move along the water's edge, reading the ground with the ease of someone reading text, and thought that her brother had chosen well when he trusted this man. She waded into the shallows alongside him. "Tell me what I'm looking for," he said. "Something waterproofed." James used oilcloth wrapped in leather usually. He'd put it inside a hollow or under a flat stone where the water pressure wouldn't shift it. They worked upstream for 20 minutes. It was Callum who found it. He came up from the water with a leather packet about the size of a thick book, dripping and dark with age, sealed at every edge with a strip of tallow-soaked cloth. He handed it to her without ceremony. She opened it at the creek's edge, her hands steady now in the way they sometimes got when the shaking period was over, and what remained was just the work. Inside 3 copper survey plates, intact, each bearing the official territorial survey impression she recognized immediately. The measurements were clear, dated 2 years prior, recording the original spring locations and boundary lines in James's precise notation. And beneath the plates, a folded document. Not a survey. A letter. On county recorder's stationery. She read it. She read it again. The letter was a request formal dated 14 months ago from the county recorder's office to Marshal Calvin Boone, asking that he provide authorization for the transfer of survey documentation from the field office to private holding. The letter listed the documents, James's documents, by name and case number, and at the bottom in handwriting she didn't recognize was a note. 4 words. Plates delivered. Arrangement confirmed. It was not signed. But it was in the same hand as the false measurements in the county land records she'd examined before leaving Harlan Creek. She was certain of it. Someone in Boone's office had been working with Fenwick's operation. Someone with access to the marshal's official stationery had authorized the removal of James's survey work. The question was whether Boone knew, or whether Boone was the arrangement. She looked up. Callum was watching her. "What is it?" he said. She handed him the letter. He read it slowly. His face changed. Not dramatically. A tightening around the eyes, a slight shift in the set of his jaw. The particular stillness of a man arriving at a conclusion he's been avoiding for some time. "Boone," he said. "The handwriting matches the false county records," she said. "I recognized it immediately. I've been through those records 3 times. "You're certain?" "I'm certain of the handwriting. I'm not certain of Boone's knowledge." She was being careful, deliberate. It could be someone in his office working without his authorization. Callum was quiet for a moment. "It could be." The way he said it told her that he didn't think it was. She was beginning to not think so either. "James encoded Boone's name in his letter to me," she said. "I only understood it this morning. He must have found this document and known what it meant. If he brought this to Boone thinking Boone would act on it." "And Boone was the problem," Callum said. Then James walked directly into the danger he thought he was escaping. The creek ran on around them, cold and indifferent. Callum secured the letter and the survey plates inside his saddlebag, with the careful hands of a man handling something that might explode if mishandled. "We have 2 more cache locations," she said. "The elevated one, and whatever the 4th notation means." "The 4th one you haven't told me about," he said. She looked at him. He looked back. "You went quiet on the trail," he said. "Something you figured out. You were deciding whether to tell me." She felt heat in her face that wasn't the summer air. "The 4th notation spells out Boone's name," she said. "I didn't want to say it until I was sure." He was quiet for a long moment. "You should tell me the things you're uncertain about," he said. "I make better decisions with more information, even uncertain information." "I understand that now," she said. "Good." He picked up his reins. "That's the kind of argument you only need to have once," she mounted. "You're surprisingly reasonable about being kept in the dark." "I'm not reasonable," he said. "I'm just tired of being surprised." They rode for the elevated cache point, moving fast, moving quiet with the dog, running steady at the left heel and the afternoon light pressing down through the pines and the weight of what they'd found sitting between them like a third presence. The elevated cache was on a rock shelf above the tree line, which meant they had to leave the horses below and climb, which meant 20 minutes of scrambling up loose shale in 2 large boots, while Callum moved above her with the aggravating ease of someone who had been doing this since childhood. She slipped twice. Both times she caught herself. Both times she heard him pause above her and felt without looking up that he was deciding whether to come back down. She didn't look up. She kept climbing. When she pulled herself onto the shelf, she was breathing hard and her palms were scraped. Callum was crouched at the far end of the shelf, looking at something she couldn't see from where she stood. She crossed to him. There was a wooden box. Small, the kind used for ammunition, sealed with a strip of leather and wedged into a crack in the rock face. It was open. Empty. Not burned, not destroyed. Simply empty. The interior still held the impression of an object that had recently been removed, a rectangular mark in the felt lining. The territorial seal. The final survey plate. The one piece that legitimized everything else. It was gone. "When?" she asked. Callum touched the edge of the box. "Recent. The felt's still dry underneath where the plate sat. 2 days, maybe 3. 2 days. While she was still riding north. While Fenwick's men were spreading out across the mountain. Someone had gotten here first. They knew," she said. "They knew where it was. Or they've been working James's notes since he disappeared and they finally found the sequence." Callum stood. His expression was controlled in the way of someone keeping a strong reaction from becoming visible. "The plates we have prove the original boundary. Without the sealed territorial plate, Fenwick's lawyer argues the others are private records, not official measurements." "I know." "Which means what we have is evidence of Fenwick's fraud, but not legal proof of the correct boundary." "I know," she said again. She was thinking hard. Where would they take it? They need the hearing. 3 days, he said. The territorial land hearing is in 3 days. Fenwick's lawyer needs to file the final claim papers by noon on the 3rd day, or the contested land reverts to review status. 3 days. She looked at the empty box. She looked at the mountain below them, vast and indifferent and full of men who wanted her to stop moving. Then she thought about what James had told her once, sitting at their mother's kitchen table, while they practiced his notation system as a game. The thing about evidence, James had said, is that there's always more than one kind. Paper can burn. Copper can disappear. But people remember what they saw. And a person who will stand up and say what they know is worth more than any document. We don't only need the plate, she said. Callum looked at her. We need witnesses, she said. People who saw what Fenwick did. Workers who helped move the false markers. People who lost water access and can testify when it changed. The plates prove the original line. Witnesses prove the intent. She looked at him directly. You know people on this mountain, Mr. Ross. People who've been affected by Fenwick's claims. People who've been silent because they were afraid. People are generally afraid for good reason, he said. Yes, she said. But the reason changes when they're not alone. She held his gaze. You've lived up here for 12 years. You know every family in this valley. They know you. If you stood in front of them and told them you were going to the hearing, I'm not a politician. I'm not asking for politics. I'm asking for company. She stepped closer. James died alone. You've been fighting alone. I came up this mountain alone. None of that has worked. She let that sit for a moment. Let me go to the settlement tomorrow. Let me talk to the families who've sold and the ones who haven't. I can read their contracts. I can show them the plates we have. And if you come with me, they'll listen differently, he said. Yes. I was looking at her in that particular way. He had that close, careful attention that made her feel like she was being read accurately for possibly the first time in her life. You're very determined, he said. My brother is dead, and the man who arranged it might be wearing a marshal's star, she said. Determined seems appropriate. Something moved across his face. Not softness. Something more complicated. The expression of a man who has been alone with a principle for so long that encountering someone who shares it is both a relief and a disruption. All right, he said. 2 words. But she heard everything in the pause before them, every year of isolation, every closed door, every morning. He'd fed his horses and looked at a mountain he'd decided was safer than people. The settlement first, he said. Then we figure out the 4th cache. The 4th cache might be connected to Boone, she said. We should think about what that means before we go anywhere near his jurisdiction. Agreed. He started down the rock face. Think fast. We've got about 2 hours of good light. She started down after him. Halfway down, her borrowed boot caught a seam in the shale, and she slid 3 feet before she caught a handhold. From below, without looking up, Callum said, I've got you. She found her footing. She didn't need him to catch her. But she understood, making her way down that rock face in the long summer light, that there was a version of having someone that had nothing to do with being caught. A version that was simply the knowledge that someone was below you paying attention, and that the mountain was less dangerous for it. She reached the bottom. He was already there, reins in hand, waiting. Neither of them said anything. They rode back down through the pines together toward a settlement full of frightened people, and a hearing 3 days away, and a marshal whose name was written in her brother's code, like a warning she'd almost missed, and the dog ran ahead of them into the gathering dark, like he already knew the way. The settlement at Dry Fork was smaller than Margaret had expected, and quieter than it had any right to be at supper time. Callum rode in ahead of her, and she watched the way the place responded to him, not with warmth exactly, but with a kind of cautious recognition, the way people acknowledge someone they've decided to trust, but haven't yet decided to follow. A man repairing a fence post stopped working and watched. A woman at a well looked up and held the look. 2 children disappeared inside a doorway. He'd said he wasn't sociable. He hadn't said he was unknown. There were 9 families at Dry Fork. By the time they had horses put up in the community barn, 6 of those families had sent someone to the meeting room of the only building, large enough to hold them, a low-ceilinged structure that served, depending on the week, as a church, a school, and a gathering hall. Margaret stood at the front of it with her survey plates wrapped in oilcloth on the table before her, wearing work trousers, belted with satin, and boots 2 sizes too large, and she looked out at the faces of people who had been frightened for a long time and had learned to call it acceptance. An older woman with iron gray hair sat in the front row with her arms crossed and her expression set. She introduced herself as Ruth Aldridge. She had sold her north pasture to Fenwick's representative 4 months ago. Because I had no water, she said flatly, before Margaret had finished explaining what the plates contained. He rerouted the creek, just moved it, dug a new channel on his side of the line. My cattle were dying. The offer he made was the only offer I got. That diversion is illegal, Margaret said. The original survey places that creek within public water rights. He had no authority to redirect it. The county recorder said different. The county recorder received payment to say different. Margaret held up the letter from the cash. This is documentation of that payment, dated 14 months ago. Ruth looked at the letter. She looked at Margaret. Who are you? My name is Margaret Calloway. My brother James Hartwell was the surveyor who discovered what Fenwick did. He hid this evidence before he was taken. He's dead now. She held Ruth's gaze. I came up the mountain to finish what he started. Silence. Then a man from the second row, young with a split lip that was still healing, said, They beat my father last month. Told him it was a warning. Told him the next warning wouldn't leave him walking. Callum moved from the wall where he'd been standing. He didn't raise his voice. Fenwick's operation depends on you believing you're alone, he said. You're not. You're 9 families in one room, and there are more in the valley who'd be here if they knew this meeting was happening. He paused. The territorial hearing is in 3 days. We need people willing to testify, not to fight, not to threaten, to walk into that hearing room and say what they saw. Another silence. And if we testify and Fenwick walks free anyway, Ruth said. Then we're exactly where we are right now, Callum said. Except Fenwick knows we tried, and that changes how afraid of him we ought to be. Ruth held his eyes for a long moment. Then she uncrossed her arms. They stayed the night at Ruth's place. Margaret slept on a narrow cot in a room that smelled like dried lavender and old wood, and she lay on her back in the dark and listened to the mountains settle around her and tried to think clearly about the 4th cache. She reconstructed James's letter for the 100th time, the 4th notation. She'd translated it as Boone, but she'd been working with the assumption that it pointed to a location the way the first 3 had. What if it didn't? What if the 4th notation wasn't a location at all, but a key, the name you needed to know before the location made sense? She sat up. If Boone's name was the key, then the location itself was something associated with Boone, something he owned, managed, or controlled, something James would have connected to the marshal. The marshal's office in Harlan Creek had a property room, a secure room where evidence and confiscated items were held pending court proceedings. James had gone to Boone to report the false survey markers 14 months ago. If James had given Boone a copy of the territorial seal plate at that meeting, trusting Boone as a lawman, and Boone had taken it into evidence holding rather than acting on it, then the final plate wasn't hidden on the mountain at all. It was sitting in a locked room in the county marshal's office under a case number that probably listed James Hartwell as a suspect rather than a complainant. She got up and went to find Callum. How was outside, which she had already started to understand, was his default for any hour when sleep wasn't working. He was standing at the fence in the dark, and the dog was beside him, and both of them were looking at nothing in particular, with the companionable patience of creatures who'd learned that night was just time that moved slower. She told him what she'd worked out. He was quiet for long enough that she started to think she'd made a logical error somewhere. Then he said, James came back to Boone. Before he disappeared, yes. I think he gave Boone the seal plate as official evidence. He thought Boone would open an investigation. And Boone took the plate and opened a case listing James as a thief, to justify confiscating his survey work as stolen county property. She pressed her fingers against the fence rail. It would be the neatest solution possible. James's evidence becomes county property under a false case number. Boone controls access. Fenwick never needs to touch it directly. And if we want that plate, Callum said, we have to go into Boone's office and take it. Or convince Boone to produce it voluntarily. Callum made a sound. I know, she said. We have 2 days before the hearing. I know. And if Boone knows we're coming, he'll move it or destroy it, she said. Yes, I've thought about that. So we go in without warning, he said. Without telling anyone in Harlan Creek we're coming. And without using the front door, she said. He looked at her. James used to describe Boone's office to me, she said. He went there several times before he disappeared. He mentioned a back property room with a window facing the alley. He mentioned it because the lock was a particular type, a sergeant lever lock. He said an older model, the kind the county bought in bulk in '74 and never replaced. She paused. My father used the same lock on his equipment barn. James showed me how to open it with a bent wire when I was 15 because I kept losing the key. There was a long pause. You're going to break into the marshal's office, Callum said. I'm going to retrieve stolen survey evidence from an unlocked property room, she said, with a slightly bent wire. He looked at her for a moment longer. Your brother taught you that, he said. James was occasionally a bad influence, she said. I'm beginning to appreciate it. He pushed off from the fence. We ride at first light. She nodded. She turned back toward the house. Margaret. She stopped. It was the first time he'd used her given name. Not ma'am, not Miss Calloway, Margaret, with the same directness he brought to everything. She turned. You figured out in one night something I'd been working toward for a year, he said. He wasn't making it a compliment. I was just making it a fact. Your brother had good judgment about people. She held on to that for a moment. Get some sleep, he said. Harlan Creek doesn't forgive slow thinking. She went inside. Harlan Creek, in midsummer morning, looked exactly like what it was, a town that belonged to one man and had mostly stopped minding. The storefronts were prosperous, particular eyes-down efficiency of a population that had learned not to notice things. They came in from this north road, before the business district was fully awake, split off from each other at the livery. Margaret taking Pepper to the far stall. Callum keeping his black horse closer to the south exit, and arranged a signal. If either of them wasn't at the agreed point within 30 minutes, the other went for Ruth Aldridge and the settlers. 30 minutes. Margaret went down the alley behind the marshal's building, carrying nothing that couldn't be explained, and the bent wire she'd fashioned from a fence staple at Ruth's place. The property room window was where James had said it was. The lock was exactly the model he'd described. She had it open in 4 minutes, which was 2 minutes slower than when she was 15, but the window was small, and she had to work at an awkward angle, and she counted the 4 minutes as acceptable. She went through the window. The property room was orderly, in the way of institutional spaces numbered and shelved, with the methodical bureaucratic care of someone who wanted plausible deniability rather than genuine organization. She read case numbers. She moved along the shelves with controlled urgency, reading fast-running James's case number, permutations in her head, because she knew how he numbered his official work. She found it on the third shelf, a case file labeled with a date. 3 months after James's disappearance, under a case number she recognized as James's own field numbering system, appropriated and reassigned. Inside the file, the territorial seal plate, wrapped in felt, intact, and beneath it, a second document she hadn't expected. James's original complaint letter to Boone, dated 14 months ago. The copy James would have kept handwritten, detailed, signed, listing every false marker location, every redirected water source, every bribed county official James had been able to verify. And at the bottom of the letter, in different ink, added later, Marshal Boone's signature, and a note in his handwriting. Complainant found to have stolen county survey materials. Case transferred to county recorder for action. No further investigation warranted. He'd read James's complaint and buried it the same day. And then Margaret understood he'd sent word to Fenwick that the problem had been identified and managed. And James had disappeared 11 days later. She stood in that property room with the plate and the letter in her hands, and she was very still for a moment, and the stillness had nothing to do with caution. James had trusted this man, had walked into this office with his evidence and his careful documentation, and his belief that the law would function the way law was supposed to function. And Boone had sat across a desk from him, had accepted the complaint letter, had signed his name at the bottom, and had handed him to Fenwick. She put the plate and the letter inside her jacket. She was out the window in 45 seconds. She was at the livery in 3 minutes. Callum took one look at her face. You found it, he said. I found more than I expected, she said. Ride, now. I'll tell you on the trail. She told him. He didn't say anything for a long time after. The horse moved under him, and the summer dust rose, and the town fell behind them, and he was quiet in the specific way of a man absorbing something that changes the shape of a situation he thought he understood. He knew James, he finally said. He sat across a desk from him, Margaret said. He read his letter. He knew exactly what James had found and exactly how much danger James was in, and he added his signature to the document that ended James's protection. 11 days later. 11 days. Callum's jaw was tight. I filed complaints with Boone. I know. I sat in his office 3 times. He wrote things down. He said he'd look into it. I was inventorying the opposition, she said quietly. Every visit you made told him what you knew and how close you were. He was silent. I'm sorry, she said. It was inadequate. She said it anyway. Don't be sorry, he said, not harshly, with the flat economy of someone redirecting energy towards something useful. Be ready for what comes next. Boone will know the property room has been accessed by tomorrow morning at the latest, possibly sooner if he checks regularly. Then we need to be at the hearing before he realizes we have the plate. 2 days. 2 days, she said. Which means we need to get testimony from the settlers tonight and file a formal complaint with the territorial agent before Boone can move to dismiss. Where is the territorial agent? Whitmore, Callum said. Day and a half ride east. She calculated. If we leave now, we get to Whitmore by tomorrow evening, file with the agent, come back through Harlan Creek for the hearing. He looked at her. You haven't slept more than 4 hours in 2 days. I'm aware. I'm not asking. Then why mention it? Because I need you thinking clearly at the hearing, he said. Not running on anger. She looked at him. I'm thinking clearly, she said. I'm also angry. Both things are true at the same time, Mr. Ross. I find that anger properly directed improves my thinking rather than impairing it. He held her gaze. All right, he said. They rode east. Ruth Aldridge sent her youngest son as a rider to the other Valley families. By nightfall, she had 5 written statements witnessed and signed describing specific incidents of water diversion, marker relocation, and intimidation. Thomas, the young man with the split lip, added a statement naming the men who had threatened his father and the date and the exact words used. Margaret sat at Ruth's table and organized the evidence package with the same system James had used for official filings. Seal plate, survey plates, complaint letter with Boone's notation, county recorder payment record, 5 settler statements. She checked it 3 times. Callum sat across from her. He was going through his own records 3 years of cattle movement logs that showed dateline by dateline exactly when and how Fenwick's cattle had begun using water sources on Callum's registered range. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Callum said without looking up from his logs, James told you to find me. Yes. He could have told you to go to the territorial office directly. He could have. But he sent you to me first. She looked up. Yes. He was still looking at his records. He knew you'd need someone who understood the mountain. That's one reason, she said. What's the other? She was quiet for a moment. I think James knew that you'd been fighting this alone for 3 years, and that you were going to lose if you kept doing it alone. I think he understood that you needed someone on your side for different reasons than I did. She paused. He had a generous way of reading people. You said so yourself. Callum was quiet. He was right about you, she said. You're exactly what he said you were. Antisocial and difficult. Honest, she said. He said honest first. He finally looked up. For a moment in the lamplight of Ruth Aldridge's kitchen, with the evidence package between them, and 2 days until a hearing that was going to determine whether 12 years of Callum's work and James's life and 9 families' futures had meant anything for just that moment. The way he looked at her was not the look of a man calculating a problem. It was something else. She looked back. Then Ruth came in from the next room to ask about coffee, and the moment folded itself away, and they both returned to the work. They reached Whitmore at sundown the following day. The territorial agent's name was Horace Webb. He was 53 years old, gray-mustached, and the kind of bureaucrat who had survived in government service by being genuinely competent without advertising it. He received them in his office with the neutral courtesy of a man accustomed to disputes and not easily impressed. He was impressed by the seal plate. He turned it over in his hands 3 times, reading the impression with the practiced attention of someone who understood exactly what official documentation looked like and how rarely it appeared in good faith disputes. "This is the original survey seal," he said. "I have the registration records from the Territorial Survey Office going back to '68. This matches the field registration for this range." "Yes," Margaret said. "And you found this in Marshall Boone's property room, under a false case file, with my brother's original complaint letter, which Boone marked closed the same day it was filed." Webb looked at the letter. He read it carefully. He read Boone's notation. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something in his posture shifted. "This is a serious allegation against a county marshal," he said. "Yes," Margaret said. "It is. You understand what you're asking me to do." "I'm asking you to do your job, Mr. Webb," she said. "My brother trusted the county system and died for it. The families in this valley trusted the county system and lost their water rights and their land. I'm asking the territorial system to be different." Webb set the letter down. He looked at Callum. "You filed complaints with Marshall Boone's office 3 times. "Yes." "Documented." "I have the records." Webb looked at the full package on his desk. Then he said, "I can issue a hold on the Fenwick land claim pending territorial review. That stops tomorrow's hearing and triggers a federal boundary examination." "Fenwick's lawyer will argue the hold is procedurally invalid," Margaret said. "He's welcome to make that argument," Webb said. "He'll be making it to the federal court, not the county court. That's a different conversation." He picked up his pen. "I'll also issue a notice requiring Marshall Boone to appear before the Territorial Review Board within 30 days. He paused. "It won't remove him immediately. But it will put him under federal oversight," Callum said. "For everything he does from the moment this notice is served," Webb said. "Yes." He began writing. "I'll need one of you to remain here tonight to sign these documents as the complaining party. The other can ride ahead to Harlan Creek and make sure the hearing room knows a federal hold is coming before Fenwick's lawyer can move to accelerate the proceedings." Callum looked at Margaret. She knew what he was thinking. She was the one with the legal training. She should be the one staying to sign. But he was the one who could ride to Harlan Creek in the dark and be there before dawn and make certain that whatever Garrett and Fenwick tried to arrange in the next 12 hours ran into something unmovable. "I'll stay," she said. He nodded. He picked up his hat. He got almost to the door. She said, "Callum." He stopped. It was the first time she'd used his given name. He turned. "Be careful," she said, not as instruction, as something else. He held her gaze. "Don't let Webb renegotiate the documents while I'm gone," he said. "I won't," she said. He left. She listened to his horse leave the yard at a run. Then she sat back down across from Webb and picked up the first document. "All right," she said. "Walk me through it." She signed 4 sets of documents over the next 2 hours. Webb was meticulous, and she didn't rush him because meticulous meant durable, and durable meant Fenwick's lawyers couldn't find a procedural thread to pull. At the end, Webb set the pen down and looked at her. "Your brother filed a similar package with the county office 18 months ago," he said. "Yes. I should tell you that a copy of that complaint reached this office, through an unofficial channel." He looked at his desk. "I received it anonymously. I wasn't able to act on an anonymous complaint without a named complaining party." She was very still. "I kept it," he said. "I kept it because it was good work. Thorough documentation. The kind of work that matters." He opened his desk and removed a sealed folder. "I believe this is your brother's handwriting." She took it. She opened it. It was James. His notation, his measurements, his formal complaint language. A complete copy of the package he'd taken to Boone posted anonymously to the territorial office before he was taken. A contingency. A backup plan he'd made without telling her, without telling Callum, without trusting anyone else to carry it. James had known Boone was dangerous before he walked into that office. He'd sent the copy first, and then he'd gone anyway, because he believed someone had to. She held the folder, and she didn't cry. She was too tired and too close to the end of something that had taken 8 months and 1 ruined marriage and a mountain, and a man who was riding through the dark right now because James had been right about him too. She didn't cry, but she sat with it for a moment. Webb let her. "He sounds like he was a good surveyor," Webb said quietly. "He was the best person I knew," she said. She set the folder carefully on top of the evidence package. Webb sealed everything with the territorial office stamp. "The hearing is at 9 tomorrow morning," he said. "My deputy will deliver the hold notice to the courthouse by 8. And if Fenwick tries to convene early, then whoever is in that hearing room at 8 o'clock is the territorial deputy with a federal document," Webb said. "Fenwick can convene all he likes." She stood. "Thank you," she said. "Thank your brother," Webb said. "He did the hard part." She rode into Harlan Creek at 6 in the morning. She found Callum at the corner of the main street and the courthouse lane, sitting on his black horse, with the stillness of someone who had been there for some time and was prepared to be there considerably longer. The dog was at his heel. Ruth Aldridge was there. So were 3 other Valley residents who had ridden through the night. Thomas was there with his statement in his coat pocket and his split lip set in a determined line. Callum looked at her when she rode up. "Webb's deputy is coming," she said. "Hold notice, Federal Review." "Good," he said. "Fenwick. Arrived an hour ago. He and his lawyer went into the courthouse through the back." Callum's eyes were on the building. "Boone went in with them." She absorbed that. "He knows," she said. "Probably knew when we left Whitmore." "Does he know what we have?" "He knows we went into his property room," Callum said. "He'll assume we have the plate, so he'll argue we stole county evidence." "He'll try," Callum said. He finally looked at her. Not at the courthouse, not at Boone's office, not at the road, at her. "You got the document signed?" "Everyone." He was quiet for a moment. "Then we walk in," he said. She straightened in the saddle. The courthouse steps were 10 yards away. Somewhere inside, Aldous Fenwick was sitting in a chair that had been constructed specifically for him in a county that had been bent specifically to his purpose, speaking to a marshal who had built his reputation on burying exactly this kind of mourning. Behind her were 9 families who had ridden through the night because someone had finally told them they weren't alone. Beside her was a man who had spent 12 years on a mountain holding a line nobody else would hold. And in her jacket was her brother's work and Webb's seal, and a letter in Boone's own handwriting that said everything that needed to be said about who the real thief in this county had always been. "Ready?" Callum asked. She dismounted. "I've been ready since the church steps," she said. They walked up the courthouse steps together with Ruth Aldridge and Thomas and the Valley families behind them, and the dog moved to the door first and sat beside it like he'd been asked to hold it open, and the morning sun came over the eastern ridge and lit the whole street up gold. And for the first time since she'd torn the veil from her face on the edge of Harlan Creek, Margaret Calloway felt the specific weight of what was about to happen. Not fear. Not exactly. Something larger than fear that had been pressed down under it for 8 months. Callum held the door. She walked in. The hearing room was already half full when they walked in, and the half that was full belonged to Fenwick. His lawyer, a narrow man named Croft, who wore his suit like armor, was arranging documents at the front table with the practiced efficiency of someone who had won in rooms like this before and expected to win again. Aldous Fenwick sat beside him, not nervous, not hurried, with the settled patience of a man who had purchased the outcome in advance and was simply waiting for the formality to conclude. He looked up when Margaret walked in. Something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly. More like the recalculation of a man who had expected a smaller problem and was revising upward. He looked at Callum. He looked at the settlers filing in behind them. He looked at Ruth Aldridge, who sat in the front row on the opposite side, and returned his gaze without blinking. Then he looked at Margaret again, and she saw the moment when Aldous Fenwick understood that what he'd purchased had not stayed purchased. She walked to the complainant's table and set down the evidence package without looking at him again. Boone was standing to the right of the judge's bench. He watched her cross the room. His expression was the careful neutral of a man who had been performing trustworthiness for so long that the performance had become second nature. But his eyes moved to the package on her table, and something in them went very still the way water goes still before it freezes. The county judge, a man named Aldridge, no relation to Ruth, who owed his appointment to Fenwick's recommendation 3 years prior, called the room to order at 5 minutes past 9. At 6 minutes past 9, the door opened, and Webb's territorial deputy walked in. Howe was 26 years old and looked it, but he carried the federal document like it was a weapon, which it was, and he walked to the judge's bench and placed it in front of Judge Aldridge with the flat courtesy of someone delivering information that did not require the recipient's agreement. "Federal hold on the Fenwick land claim," he said. "Pending territorial boundary review. Issued this morning by Territorial Agent Horace Webb." The room went silent. Croft was on his feet before the deputy finished the sentence. "This is procedurally invalid," he said. "The hearing was called under county jurisdiction. The territorial office has no authority to intervene in a properly convened county proceeding. The territorial office has authority over any land claim touching federal survey boundaries," the deputy said with the tone of someone reading from a document he had memorized specifically for this response. "Which this claim does according to the registered survey records filed with the territorial office in 1871. Those records are in dispute." "Which is precisely why the hold exists," Margaret said. Every head in the room turned. She stood at the complainant's table, with her hands flat on the surface, and she looked at Croft with the specific expression of a woman who had ridden 2 days on no sleep and broken into a marshal's office and sat across from the man responsible for her brother's death, and had not once through any of it lost her ability to think in straight lines. "A disputed boundary cannot be legally adjudicated at the county level when territorial survey records contradict the county records," she said. "That's not an argument. That's the Territorial Code Section 14, Article 7. If Mr. Croft would like to confirm, I have a copy." Croft looked at her. Fenwick looked at her. Boone looked at her. None of them spoke immediately, which told her everything about whether they'd expected her to know Section 14, Article 7. "The lady doesn't have standing in this proceeding," Croft said. He turned back to the judge. "She is not a party to the land claim. She is the complaining party in a federal boundary dispute," the deputy said. "Her standing is established by the territorial agent's hold notice. Paragraph 2. He hadn't moved. He was very young, Margaret thought, and very good at his job. Judge Aldridge was reading the hold notice. He read it twice. Howe was a man in a difficult position, and he knew it. He'd built his career on Fenwick's goodwill, and Fenwick's goodwill was currently sitting 4 feet away from him, waiting for him to make a decision. But federal documents had federal consequences, and county judges who ignored federal documents had federal problems, and Judge Aldridge had Margaret suspected just enough self-preservation instinct to understand which way the wind was blowing. "The hearing is suspended pending territorial review," he said. Croft made a sound. Fenwick put one hand on Croft's arm. Croft sat down. Fenwick looked at Margaret. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was the same as it had always been, measured, courteous, with the practiced warmth of a man who had learned that warmth cost nothing and purchased quite a lot. "I don't know what you believe you've accomplished here today. I've suspended your land claim," she said, "and I'm about to do considerably more." She opened the evidence package. What happened next was not dramatic in the way that fiction sometimes required. It was quieter than that, and more relentless, and in some ways more devastating. She laid the documents out in sequence, the original survey plates first. She explained each one, reading the measurements aloud in the plain, clear language. James had taught her translating the technical notation into words that Ruth Aldridge and Thomas and the families in the back row could follow without formal survey training. She showed the original spring locations. She showed the boundary lines as recorded by federal surveyors in 1871. Then she showed where those lines had been physically moved. She had Callum's cattle logs. He stood and read 3 years of movement records in his flat, careful voice, date by date, showing when Fenwick's cattle had first appeared on his registered range. The dates corresponded precisely to the period after the boundary markers were relocated. Thomas stood up without being asked. His voice shook slightly at first. He'd been threatened, he said. His father had been beaten, he said. He named the men who did it. He named the date. He named what they told his father would happen next if his father filed a complaint. He sat down. His voice wasn't shaking when he sat down. Croft objected to every piece of testimony. The deputy overruled most of them on grounds of territorial relevance. Judge Aldridge overruled the rest with the careful efficiency of a man building a record that protected himself. Then Margaret set the county recorder payment letter on the table. She read it. She explained the handwriting match to the false boundary records. She heard Fenwick's breathing change from across the room. Not loud, but she was listening for it. Then she set down Boone's complaint notation. She read James's complaint letter aloud. She read Boone's handwritten response. The room was absolutely silent. She looked at Boone. "You read my brother's complaint," she said. "You signed his letter. You understood what he had found." She kept her voice level. It cost her something. She paid it. And 11 days later he disappeared. Boone said nothing. "I want to know where he is," she said. Still nothing. Marshal Boone. She held his gaze with everything she had. "I want to know where my brother is." The silence lasted long enough that Ruth Aldridge made a quiet sound behind her. Then Boone said, "I don't know what happened to James Hartwell." He said it like a man who had practiced saying it. He said it like a man who had said it to himself every night for 14 months. Margaret looked at him for one more moment. "Then tell me who does," she said. Boone looked at Fenwick. It was barely a glance. Half a second. The involuntary kind that happens before the brain catches up with the body. But Ruth Aldridge saw it. Thomas saw it. Callum saw it. And Judge Aldridge, who was watching the room with the focused attention of a man trying to understand which way this situation was going to fall, saw it too. The room broke then. Not into chaos, into the particular controlled disruption of people who have been holding a position for a long time and have just been given permission to stand up. Ruth spoke next. She described the water diversion in specific terms when it happened, what changed, who came to her property, to explain that her water rights had been legally transferred to Fenwick's company under a county order she'd never been shown. 3 other settlers followed. Croft tried twice more to redirect the proceeding toward the original land claim. The third time, Margaret set James's backup copy, the package posted anonymously to the territorial office directly in front of Judge Aldridge. "This was received by the territorial agent's office 9 months ago," she said. "It is a complete copy of the evidence package my brother prepared before his disappearance, posted to the territorial office before he went to Marshal Boone." She let that land. "My brother was not a foolish man, Your Honor. He knew the risk he was taking. He made sure the evidence would survive him." Judge Aldridge read the cover page. He set it down. He looked at Fenwick. Aldous Fenwick, for the first time in the proceedings, looked at the table. That small motion, a man who had faced down county hearings and boundary disputes and years of settler resistance, choosing in this particular moment to look at a table, told the room everything that still needed telling. Croft leaned close to Fenwick and said something quiet. Fenwick shook his head once. Whatever Croft had suggested, Fenwick wasn't taking it. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Margaret, and when he spoke, he used the voice he used with people he needed to believe, he respected. "This proceeding has been improperly influenced by federal interference and by a complaining party who has admittedly removed items from county evidence storage. Under the authority of the territorial hold," the deputy said from his position near the door. "Be that as it may," Fenwick said, "any determination made today is contingent on the territorial review, and I am fully prepared to cooperate with that review." He paused. "I have confidence that a proper federal examination will confirm the legitimacy of my survey records." He sat back down. He said it like a man who had survived 15 years of exactly this kind of mourning, and who had survived by always knowing when to retreat from one battlefield to regroup for the next, and he would have gotten away with it. Except that Thomas stood up again. He was 17 years old, and his lip was still split from a warning he hadn't been meant to survive, with his voice intact, and he looked at Fenwick and said, "Your man Garrett told my father that the last surveyor who made trouble ended up in the North Canyon." He said it like he meant for us to know what happened. The room went absolutely still. "The North Canyon," Callum said. His voice was different from anything she'd heard from him before. Not loud. Quieter, if anything. the quiet of something reaching a conclusion it had been building toward for a long time. He looked at Fenwick. "That's where the spring runs underground for about a quarter-mile before it surfaces again," he said. "I've ridden it. I've looked for your brother," he said to Margaret. "I didn't go far enough in." She understood what he was telling her. She understood, and she made herself hold it together for 30 more seconds, because there were 30 more seconds of this hearing that mattered, and she was the only one at the table who knew how to close it. "Your Honor," she said, "I request that the Federal Boundary Review include a physical examination of the North Canyon survey markers and the area immediately surrounding them. I request that this examination be conducted by territorial officers rather than county representatives." She paused. "I also request that Marshal Calvin Boone be formally restricted from any role in evidence preservation or witness communication pending the review." Judge Aldridge had the expression of a man who had wanted to be somewhere else for the past 40 minutes and was finally seeing a door. "Granted," he said. "All 3 requests. The Fenwick land claim remains under federal hold. The territorial review will commence within 10 days. Marshal Boone is hereby notified that federal oversight applies to his office effective immediately." He brought his gavel down. "This hearing is adjourned." She made it out of the courthouse and around the corner of the building before her legs decided they'd been reliable long enough, and she sat down on a bench with her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands. Not crying. Past crying. Just sitting. She heard boots on the boardwalk, and then Callum sat down beside her. Not close. Not inappropriate. The distance of a man who understood that someone needed to not be alone without necessarily needing to be touched. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said, "The North Canyon." "I'll take territorial officers up," he said. "As soon as Webb authorizes the examination team, I know exactly where to go." She nodded. "Margaret." He waited for her to look up. "It may not be whatever they find. It may not be." "I know," she said. "I know what it probably is." He didn't try to make it something other than what it was. She had thought once that she would feel relief when this was over. When the evidence was filed and the hold was issued, and Fenwick was sitting across a hearing room watching his purchase unravel. She'd imagined relief as the feeling that waited on the other side of all of this. What she felt instead was tired and sad and more clear-headed than she'd been in 8 months. "He knew," she said. "James knew going to Boone was dangerous. He posted the evidence to Webb first. He had a plan." "How was smart," Callum said. "He was braver than I gave him credit for." She looked at her hands. "I told him not to make trouble. When he came to me before he disappeared, I told him that being right about something wasn't worth losing his position over." She was quiet for a moment. "I was protecting him. Or I thought I was." "You couldn't have known what Boone was." "No." She accepted that. It didn't make the other thing smaller, but she accepted it. "He didn't blame me. In his letter to me, the one at the cache, he didn't blame me." She paused. "He said I taught him to keep records because truth without proof could be buried." Callum was quiet. "That's true," he finally said. "You're the one who read his notation system. You're the one who understood what the 4th cache meant. Without you, the seal plate stays in Boone's property room until the hearing is over and Fenwick files his final claim, and there's nothing left to contest." He looked at her directly. "Your brother sent you up that mountain because he knew you'd finish it. He was right." She looked back at him, in the street. She could hear Ruth Aldridge talking to Thomas, her voice carrying the particular tone of an older woman telling a younger person something worth remembering. She could hear the settlers, her settlers, she thought James's settlers, the valley's settlers, making the small sounds of people who had been carrying something heavy and had just been permitted to set it down. "What happens to you now?" she said. Callum looked at the street. "What do you mean?" "The boundary review, the territorial examination. Your ranch is in the contested area until the review concludes." "I've been in a contested area for 3 years," he said. "I'll manage a few more weeks. And after..." He was quiet for a moment. "After I have a boundary that's legally recorded. I have water rights that are documented. I have a ranch I can run without Fenwick's men crossing my north pasture." He paused. It's what I had before. It's what should have always been. You'll go back to the mountain, she said. Yes. She nodded. They were both quiet. She had an offer waiting, she knew it was coming, had seen it in Webb's manner when they were finishing the documents. The Territorial Survey Office needed people who understood James's notation system and could work the boundary review. It would be temporary, 2 months perhaps, with the possibility of a permanent position afterward if she chose it. A respectable position. Her own income. Her own authority. Everything she'd been told a woman in her situation should be grateful to stumble into. She should tell Callum about the offer. She wasn't sure why she was waiting to. Fenwick won't go quietly, she said instead. Croft will challenge the federal review. He'll lose. Eventually. These things take time. I have time, Callum said. It's the one thing the mountain provides in abundance. He said it without self-pity, which was how he said most things, as pure observation, stripped of the emotional freight that other people loaded onto their own lives. She had come to understand that this wasn't coldness. It was a kind of precision. He said what was true, and he left the rest of it alone. She had spent 27 years being careful with words for different reasons, to be polite, to be appropriate, to avoid conflict, to perform the softness that was expected of her. Callum was careful with words because he meant every one of them. She found that she had started doing the same thing around him. They'll find James, she said, in the canyon. Yes, he said. I need to be there when they do. I know. And I need to bring him home. I'll make sure the territorial team knows that, he said. His remains come home with his sister. That's not negotiable. She looked at the street. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said. He was my surveyor. He did his job and then some. I owe him. She almost let it go at that. Callum, she said. He looked at her. You don't have to frame everything as a debt, she said quietly. Some things can just be because they matter. He held her gaze. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, some things do. He stood. He picked up his hat from the bench beside him. Webb's office will contact you about the review, he said. I'd imagine tomorrow. The territorial process moves faster when Fenwick is the respondent. There's enough on record that Webb won't drag his feet. And you'll go back to the mountain, she said again. Tomorrow, he said. The stock needs tending. He settled his hat. I was going to walk away. Now she understood. He was going to walk back to his horse with the same economy of motion he brought to everything, and he was going to ride north, and the mountain was going to take him back the way it always had, and she was going to have a territorial survey position, and her brother's evidence properly filed, and a legal record that would protect 9 families' water rights for the foreseeable future. She was going to have done what James asked. She should feel complete. She felt the specific ache of something that had not yet been said. The gray mare, she said. Pepper, she's still in your barn. He stopped. He turned. She is, he said. Someone will need to come for her. Someone will, he said. Neither of them said the obvious thing. He touched the brim of his hat, that spare, genuine gesture, and he walked back toward the main street. She watched him go. Behind her, Ruth Aldridge appeared at the corner of the building and stopped when she saw Margaret's expression. Ruth was 61 years old and had been married to a good man for 30 years and had buried him in drought season 2 years ago and had kept her ranch through it and through Fenwick and through everything else the valley had sent her direction. She looked at Margaret. She looked at Callum's retreating back. Oh, honey, she said. Don't, Margaret said. I'm just saying. I know what you're just saying. Ruth sat down beside her on the bench. He's going back to his mountain, Margaret said. And I'm staying to work the territorial review. Those are separate things, Margaret said. They're in separate directions. They are, Ruth agreed. How far away is that mountain, would you say? Margaret looked at her. Half a day's ride, Ruth said. Give or take. I've made it in 4 hours when I had reason. Margaret said nothing. The mare's up there, Ruth said. You'll need your horse eventually. Ruth, I'm just observing facts. Margaret looked down the street where Callum had gone. The dog appeared from around the corner and sat at the edge of the boardwalk, looking back at Margaret with yellow eyes. He seemed to be waiting. "Your brother sent you up that mountain for a reason," Ruth said. "Maybe there was more than one." The dog waited. Margaret stood up. "I need to send a letter to Webb about the canyon examination schedule," she said. "Of course you do," Ruth said. "And I need to find somewhere to sleep tonight." "You'll stay with me," Ruth said. "Thank you." "And in the morning," Ruth said, "you'll do whatever you need to do." Margaret looked at the dog. The dog looked at her with the patience of an animal that had learned to wait for the slow ones. "Your master," she told the dog, "is the most difficult man I've met in my entire life." The dog's tail moved once. He stood up. He turned north. He looked back at her. She picked up the evidence package from the bench. She followed. Not all the way. Not yet. Just to the edge of the street where she could see Callum at the hitching rail checking his cinch with the habitual care of a man who trusted his own hands more than luck. He didn't look up, but his hands slowed slightly. She stopped at the edge of the boardwalk. "The territorial review is 2 weeks," she said. He finished with the cinch. "I know," he said. "After that I'll need to collect the mare." He untied the reins. He turned the horse. "The trail's clear this time of year," he said, "assuming you remember the route." "I remember it." He mounted. He looked down at her from the saddle with gray eyes that said approximately 8 different things, none of which he was going to put into words right now, because that was not who he was, and she was beginning to understand that it was also not who she needed him to be. She could read the other things. She was getting better at that. 2 weeks, she said. "I'll have coffee on," he said. He turned the horse north and rode, and the dog ran ahead of him up the main street, and Margaret stood on the boardwalk in work trousers, belted with wedding satin, and watched them go until the street curved and took them out of sight. Then she went to find paper and a pen, because there were letters to write, and a review to prepare, and a brother to bring home. And after that, she had a mountain to find her way back to. The territorial review took 17 days, not 14. Margaret knew this because she counted them. Not obsessively, she had too much work for obsession, but in the way you count things that mark the distance between where you are and where you intend to be. The first week was documentation. Webb's office processed the evidence package with the methodical thoroughness she'd hoped for, and she sat across from 3 different territorial examiners and explained James's notation system until she could do it in her sleep, which she nearly did twice. The copper survey plates were formally authenticated. The recorder's payment letter was compared against county financial records, and the match was confirmed by 2 independent examiners. Boone's notation on James's complaint was entered into the federal record with the date and a legal assessment that used the phrase willful obstruction of justice in the kind of flat permanent language that courts remembered. The second week was harder. The canyon examination team went north on a Tuesday. Callum guided them. Margaret had asked to come, and Webb had gently firmly told her that the examination was a federal process, and next of kin presence could complicate evidentiary protocol. And she had sat in Webb's office for 10 minutes after he said it without speaking, and then she had said that she understood and gone back to her desk. She didn't sleep well that week. She wrote letters. She helped Ruth draft a formal water rights restoration petition for the families who had sold under coercion. She read survey code until her eyes ached. She found a boarding house 2 streets from Webb's office and paid a week in advance with money. Ruth pressed on her without making her ask for it. On the 9th day, a rider came from the north with a sealed message from Callum. 3 words. "We found him." She held the note for a long time. Then she wrote back, "Bring him home." James Hartwell came back to Harlan Creek on a Thursday morning in late August, carried in a proper pine box by Callum Ross and 2 territorial officers and a young deputy who had never met James but had read his complaint letter twice and treated the box with the respect owed to a man who had done something genuinely difficult. Margaret was at the edge of town when they arrived. She'd been standing there for an hour. Ruth had come with her and stood at a slight distance, giving her the specific proximity of someone who would be there the instant she was needed, and not one moment before. Callum rode at the front. When he saw her, he stopped his horse. He dismounted. He walked to her, and he didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say. And Margaret looked at the pine box, and then she looked at Callum, and he stood there in the morning light with his hat in his hands and his weathered face carrying everything. The past 17 days had cost him, and she understood that he had gone into that canyon, not just as a guide, but as the man who had spent 3 years failing to protect the person inside that box, and that he had carried that weight the whole way down the mountain. She put her hand on his arm. Not long. Just a moment. He covered it briefly with his own hand. Then he stepped back and put his hat on and went back to his horse, because there was a grave to arrange and a burial to see to, and both of them were people who kept moving when moving was the only way to get through something. They buried James in the Harlan Creek Cemetery, in the row where the town put the people who had mattered, which was an argument in itself about how much had changed in 3 weeks. Margaret had not expected the number of people who came. Thomas was there, and Ruth and the 9 Valley families who had ridden down for the hearing and had not entirely returned to their ordinary lives, as though some part of them understood that the ordinary lives they'd had before were not the ones they'd be returning to. Webb sent his deputy. 3 settlers from the far eastern range that Margaret had never met came because they'd heard what James had found and wanted to pay their respects to the man who'd found it. Even Judge Aldridge came, which was either conscience or political survival instinct, and Margaret decided it didn't matter which. Callum stood at the back. After the burial, when the crowd broke apart into the small, quiet movements of people who have shared a grief and are finding their way back to their separate selves. Margaret went to him. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know you have stock." "I had someone look in on them," he said. She looked at him. "Mateo," he said, "from the Eastern Range. He owes me a favor." She understood that he had arranged to stay before he knew how long the burial would take, which meant he had decided in advance that he was not going to leave her alone for this part of it. She looked at the grave. "He would have liked all of this," she said. "The territorial officers, the federal record, the notation system in official evidence." She paused. He spent years being told his work was too precise for practical use. He was told he measured things that didn't need measuring. Fenwick's boundary would have held if he hadn't measured it, Callum said. Yes. Precision mattered. It did. She was quiet for a moment. "Croft filed a procedural challenge yesterday," she said. "Against the federal hold. Webb's office expects it to be dismissed within a month." "I know," Callum said. "Webb wrote to me." She looked at him. "He wrote to you about the North Pasture boundary confirmation. Once the federal review concludes, the original survey line will be legally recorded. My water rights are fully restored." He paused. Webb also mentioned that Fenwick's banking investors have begun withdrawing. Apparently, federal scrutiny affects creditworthiness. "Good," she said. "His operation north of the ridge is already understaffed. 3 of his hired men left the week after the hearing." She thought about Garrett, who had ridden into Callum's yard with his rifle, and his rehearsed authority, and his certainty that all of this was already decided. She wondered where Garrett had gone, and then decided she didn't need to know. "Boone," she asked. "Federal oversight pending formal charges," Callum said. "Webb told me the willful obstruction finding is likely to generate criminal referral within 60 days. "Not fast enough," she said. "No," he said. "But permanent." She accepted that. Permanent mattered more than fast in the end. James had known that. He had built his evidence to last, not to move quickly. He had posted a backup copy to a federal office, and trusted that institutions, when properly pressured, would eventually function as intended. He had been right. It had cost him everything to be right, and he had done it anyway. "Webb offered me the position," she said. "Permanently. Field surveyor and documentation examiner for the territorial office." Callum looked at her. "He said they haven't had someone who could work James's notation system since James," she said. "He said the Valley families need continued oversight of their water rights, and someone should be doing it who understands the local survey history." "It's a good position," Callum said. "It is. Your own income, your own authority." He was watching her carefully. "Everything you'd have lost by going through with the wedding." Plus considerably more, she said. You'd be good at it. I know, she said. I've been doing it for 3 weeks, and I'm already better than the 2 examiners Webb has on staff. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise. Something closer to pride which she hadn't expected from him and which landed with unexpected force. Are you taking it? He asked. I haven't decided yet, she said. He was quiet. I told you I'd come for the mayor, she said. You did. I'm a woman of my word, Mr. Ross. He looked at her for a long moment. Callum, he said. She looked at him. You've called me Mr. Ross twice this morning, he said. You stopped doing that around day 2 on the mountain. I'd like you to stop doing it again. She felt something ease in her chest. Callum, she said. That's better. I'm coming for the mayor, she said. And I want to see the north pasture when the boundary markers are restored. James's survey recorded a spring on your eastern range that nobody has officially documented in 30 years. I'd like to document it properly. That would take some time, he said. Yes, she said. It would. He held her gaze. I make decent coffee, he said. I know, she said. I've had it. He put his hat on. He looked at her with those gray-brown eyes that she had learned to read like terrain, where the flat surface meant steady ground and where the slight change meant something significant was underneath. There was something significant underneath right now. She waited. When I came down from that mountain 12 years ago, he said, I made a decision that it was safer to have nothing that could be taken from me. She didn't say anything. James took something from me when he showed up asking about water rights, he said. He made me remember why I cared about the boundary in the first place. He made me care about losing it. He paused. And then you came up that ridge in a wedding dress in a thunderstorm and... He stopped. And, she said. And you made it considerably more complicated, he said. She looked at him. That is the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me, she said. I'm not a romantic man, he said. No, she agreed. You're an honest one. He was quiet. She stepped forward. She stood close enough that she could see the gray at his temples, and the lines the mountain had cut into his face, and the specific careful attention he was giving her right now, as though she were something he was afraid to calculate incorrectly. I'm not coming back to the mountain because you saved me, she said. I saved myself largely. You helped. You saved yourself entirely, he said. I provided the horse trail. And the coffee. And the coffee. She looked up at him. I'm coming back because beside you I think more clearly, she said. I'm harder to frighten. I'm better at the things that matter. She paused. I'm coming back because James sent me to find an honest man, and I found one, and I'm not inclined to ride away from that without a very good reason. I can list several good reasons, he said. The mountain is difficult. The winters are brutal. I'm not sociable, and I'm unlikely to improve significantly in that regard. Callum, she said. The nearest town is a full day's ride, and I have opinions about most of the people in it. Callum. He stopped. She said, Are you trying to talk me out of it, or are you frightened? A long pause. Both, he said. She reached up and touched his face briefly with one hand. Just that. Just the simplest possible acknowledgement. And he went very still in the way of someone receiving something he didn't know how to hold yet, but intended to learn. I know, she said quietly. I'm frightened too. He put his hand over hers. 2 weeks, he said. I told you I'd have coffee on. You did, she said. It's been 17 days. It has. He looked at her. The offer stands. She smiled. He did not kiss her in the cemetery beside her brother's grave, because he was a man with appropriate instincts about time and place. But he kept his hand over hers for a moment longer than necessary, and when they walked back toward the street together, the distance between them was different from what it had been. She went back to Webb's office that afternoon and accepted the position. Webb looked genuinely pleased, which for a government man was approximately equivalent to another person jumping on a table. I have one condition, she said. Name it. The North Pasture Spring on the Ross Range needs to be formally documented as part of the boundary confirmation. It's a legitimate water source that's been absent from official records for 30 years. Given Fenwick's history of manipulating undocumented water sources, I want it on record." Webb looked at her. "That is going to require you to spend considerable time on the mountain," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is. With a man whose property is part of the territorial review. A man whose property will be fully cleared by the review," she said. "Yes." Webb had the expression of a man who understood exactly what he was agreeing to and had decided it was not his business. "I'll authorize the survey extension," he said. "Thank you," she said. She went back to Ruth's boarding house and she wrote 3 letters. The first was to her father. She had not written to him since the wedding day, and the letter was not easy. She told him what she'd found and what James had built, and what she intended to do with her life from this point forward. She told him that she was not angry with him, which was not entirely true, but was more true than it had been 3 weeks ago. She told him that the ranch situation might be salvageable, depending on the outcome of the federal review of Fenwick's land acquisitions, and that if he wanted help navigating that process, she knew the right people now. She told him that James had not been a thief. She told him that she had buried James properly and that his grave was marked. She did not tell him she was going back to the mountain, because some things were hers to know first. The second letter was to her sister Clara, who had sewn lace on a wedding dress by candlelight and deserved to know that her sister was alive, employed, and in a situation she couldn't entirely explain but was not sorry about. The third letter she addressed simply to Eagle's Tooth Ridge, which was not a postal address but was specific enough that the Harlan Creek postmaster, who knew perfectly well where Callum Ross's cabin was, would get it there. She wrote survey extension authorized for North Pasture Spring. Arriving in 10 days to begin documentation. Please ensure the coffee is adequate. She sealed it. She held it for a moment. She turned it over and added on the outside, "Bring the dog." 10 days later, she rode north. She'd traded the wedding shoes for proper boots she'd bought herself with her first territorial pay. The sage green dress was gone. She wore a proper field kit, good canvas trousers, a cotton work shirt, a traveling jacket with enough pockets for her tools. Her satchel held survey equipment and a new set of field notes with her name, not James's, on the cover. She had a badge now, not a marshal's badge. A territorial survey examiner's identification, small and brass and heavier than it looked. She rode alone through the first 2 ridges because the trail was clear and she knew the route. At the third ridge where the trail narrowed and the drop fell away to the left, and the pines closed in on the right, she pulled Pepper up. She thought about the first time she'd ridden this section in a storm in a wedding dress going forward because going back was no longer a direction she could travel. She thought about the veil tumbling down the road in Harlan Creek. She thought about James, who had posted his evidence to a federal office before walking into a dangerous man's room because he had known that the truth needed more than one way out. She pressed her heels in and rode over the ridge. The cabin came into view at late afternoon. The paddock was full. Callum's horses moving in the unhurried way of animals that had been well tended for a long time. The barn door was open. Smoke from the stovepipe. The particular settled order of a place where someone had been working all day and was nearly finished. She rode into the yard. The dog came out first. He crossed the yard to her with his tail making a slow arc of what she had come to understand was his version of enthusiasm, and he put his head against her knee when she dismounted and she scratched his ears and said, "Good dog," and meant it entirely. Then Callum came out of the barn. He was carrying a saddle over one arm, and he stopped when he saw her. He set the saddle down on the fence rail. He looked at her, the way he'd looked at her the first night, that close, deliberate attention. The calculation that she now understood was not suspicion, but care. 10 days, he said. I said 10 days, she said. You're 2 hours early. The trail was good. He came down from the barn steps. He stopped a few feet away. You took the position, he said. I did. Webb authorized the North Pasture survey. He did. That's going to take a while, he said. The eastern spring alone needs at least 3 weeks of proper measurement. Closer to 4, she said, if we're being accurate. He was quiet for a moment. "I have the room set up," he said. "The one with the east-facing window." She looked at him. "That's the room with the best morning light," she said. "You'll need it for the field notes." "That's very practical of you." "I'm a practical man," he said. She was smiling now, and she didn't try to stop it. And he was looking at her with something in his expression that he was making no effort to conceal, which from Callum Ross was approximately equivalent to another man writing it in the sky. "The coffee," she said. "On the stove," he said. "Is it adequate?" "It's better than adequate," he said. "I've been practicing." She laughed. It came out of her before she could manage it, genuine and unguarded, and it surprised him. She could see that, and he watched it happen the way he watched things that mattered to him with full attention. Then something shifted in his face. He crossed the remaining distance between them. He was not a man who did things partially. She had learned that about him early. When he committed to a direction, he went there without hesitation and without apology. He put his hands on either side of her face, with the same careful certainty he brought to everything, and he looked at her for one moment. Just that. Just making sure she was still certain, still choosing, still here. And she looked back at him steadily, because she was all three things, and he needed to know it. Then he kissed her. Not desperate. Not the kiss of two people who had been surviving something and were relieved to be alive. Something better than that. The kiss of two people who had made a series of deliberate decisions over 17 days, and a mountain and a hearing room, and a cemetery, and 10 careful days of distance, and had arrived at this moment, not because danger had thrown them together, but because they had separately and clearly decided this was where they intended to be. She had her hands on his chest. He pulled back enough to look at her. "You're not here because I saved you," he said. "I saved myself," she said. "You helped. I provided the horse trail. And the coffee." "And the coffee," he said. She looked up at him. "And the honest company," she said. "Which turned out to matter more than either of us expected." He touched her face once briefly. "You're going to change everything about how I run this ranch," he said. "You're going to have opinions. I have excellent opinions. You're going to rearrange my shelves. Only the ones with the survey records. Your system is illogical." He made the sound that was almost a laugh. She had collected several of those now, and intended to collect more. "I make better decisions with more information," she said. "Even uncertain information. Someone told me that." His eyes warmed. "He sounds like a reasonable man," he said. "He's the most difficult man I've ever met," she said. "He's also the most honest. In my experience, those two things tend to come together." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he stepped back, picked up his saddle from the fence rail and said, "Come inside. The coffee's going to burn if we stand out here much longer." She tied Pepper to the fence. She followed him to the door. The dog went ahead of them, both tail moving through the door, and straight to his place by the hearth because he had made his own calculations about how this was going to go, and had been right about them since the beginning. That evening after supper, they sat at the table where they'd first sat opposite each other in the storm, and Callum spread the North Pasture survey maps, and she spread her new field notes, and they worked through the spring documentation plan, with the focused efficiency of two people who understood the same language and were glad to be speaking it together. At some point, he moved his chair beside hers, instead of across from her, because the angles were better for reading the maps. That was the reason he gave. She didn't argue with it. At another point she realized she had been talking for 20 minutes straight about the Eastern Creek's measurement history, and that he was listening the way he listened to things that mattered to him fully quietly, without performing attention, simply giving it. She stopped mid-sentence. "You don't have to listen to all of this," she said. "I know," he said. "You're not obligated." "I know that too." He looked at her. "I'm listening because it's worth listening to." She looked back at the maps. She thought about the church steps in Harlan Creek 3 weeks and a lifetime ago. She thought about the veil in the dust. She thought about riding north in a storm in a wedding dress because forward was the only direction available. She thought about James, who had sent her up a mountain to find an honest man, and had been right that she'd need one, and had been right about which one, and had trusted her to understand that eventually. "Thank you," she said. Callum looked up from the map. "For listening," he said. For being what James said you were, she said. It made everything else possible. He was quiet for a moment. He was a good surveyor, he said. He saw things accurately. Yes, she said. He did. Outside, the summer night settled over Eagle's Tooth Ridge, and the horses moved in the paddock and the creek ran east. The way it had always run along the line. It had always followed the true line that James had measured and Margaret had carried and Callum had held for 12 years without knowing exactly what he was holding it for. They knew now. They worked until the lamp burned low, and then they sat for a while in the easy quiet of people who had run out of necessary words and were content in the space that remained, and the dog slept, and the mountain held its old patient weight around them, and Margaret Calloway, who had torn a veil from her face 3 weeks ago and ridden north toward nothing but the truth, found that she had arrived somewhere she had not known she was looking for. Not a rescue, not a refuge, a place she had chosen. Freely, with full information, eyes open, the most honest thing she had ever done. She picked up her field notes and wrote the date at the top of the first page. Then she wrote her name. Underneath it, she wrote Eagle's Tooth Ridge. North Pasture Survey, Summer 1883. Documentation begins tomorrow. She set the pen down. Callum looked at the page. He reached over and set his thumb below her name, the same way she'd seen him set a fence post, deliberate, certain in exactly the right place. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she said. They were both still. Outside, a night bird called once from the ridge. The mountain answered with silence, which was its own kind of yes.